everybody, welcome.
Hello.
So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this week, Julian. Julian is, I looked at your GitHub page, and he has a wonderful introduction where he describes himself as a programmer and a data scientist with a particular interest in unapplied social sciences. So that was kind of a nice way of describing yourself. And Julian is here until Friday, so if you would like to speak to him or follow up on anything after this talk, you do have a little bit of an opportunity, a window there to speak to Julian further. So as usual, we will have the talk, it's recorded, right? Yes. So if you want to ask questions during the talk, please be aware that those will be included in the filmed footage, just so you have that in mind. Otherwise, hold on to your questions until the end. Well, with that said, thank you so much, Julian, for offering to give our Tuesday talk this week. We're really, really happy to have you here, and for you collaborating with Peter and everyone interested in dance. I'm sure there'll be some very, very interesting projects to emerge from this, and I'll let you start again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. I think it's really nice for me because I will try to tell you some about the research I've already done, but I will do it from a different angle than usual. So I will just judge from your reaction whether the narration, the story I'm trying to tell is a coherent one or maybe not. We will see, but I hope it will be interesting. So the story will be about the movement and the way I look at movement and how I try to approach movement as something meaningful. Starting from starting from the more personal story. Besides doing science, I also dance contact improvisation. So I attend many dance workshops, and that's one of those I got a piece of advice: avoid meaningless movement. Right? Which might be a good piece of advice, but I took my liberty to do the exact opposite. So I started to dancing with one of my friends, trying to make as many meaningless movements as possible, right? So just goofing off and trying to do unpredictable, stupid things. But then, in retrospect, talking to my partner, we discovered that we were actually able to interpret most of what was going on. And there was some meaning to it, after all, even though I very much tried them to be meaningless. So I tried to unpack this notion, what is meaningless in movement. First, what came to my mind is that there might be a movement which is not belonging to any conventional vocabulary, right? So it's very classic, like maybe a bit structuralist approach. That this phrase is meaningless because it's not grammatical, right? Or there is no such word in a dictionary. But of course, this is not what's going on in interaction, because when we are interacting with someone, we are very often able to improvise something, and still, because we are in the same context, we can communicate even using entirely made-up words, right? So also entirely improvised movements. So maybe it's more about understanding each other, right? So maybe when I'm making a move which is not understood by my partner, it's meaningless. Or maybe I'm making a move which I don't understand myself, so I don't know what's my intention doing that, right? So it also might be meaningless in some way. We could say that if there is no understanding, right, there is no purpose behind this movement. But maybe it's still on some level meaningful, right? Because even if I don't understand what I am doing and my partner doesn't understand, it doesn't mean that there is no influence of what I am doing on how the interaction evolves. Because sometimes the interaction evolves, let's say, spontaneously below this level of conscious intention. And very often when I'm exploring, I am only post factum discovering that, oh, what I did actually was very useful because it allowed me, I don't know, to hold my balance in a very specific way and do some other dance move which wasn't possible before. So the actual the movement which is truly meaningless should be one which is not influencing the ongoing interaction in any way possible, right? And if I stick to this kind of definition of meaning, then it's really hard to perform a meaningless movement. Maybe it's even easier now. I'm thinking it's much easier to have to speak a meaningless utterance, like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Yes, that's famous example of a meaningless like phrase. Or maybe it's easier to have a meaningless thought. If my thought is very abstract and not grounded in anything, maybe it's meaningless. But the movement is always there. It's always it always happens within a certain context. If it's a movement in interpersonal interaction, it almost certainly will be in some way meaningful. So the notion of meaning which I am aiming at is a very pragmatic notion. You could contrast it with a pragmatic maxim of Peirce. So it's all about the consequences that the action, the movement has for the interaction which unfolds. And if I'm able to trace those consequences, then I'm able to say that there is certain meaning here and now, very pragmatic, but it is in some way meaningful. Who is the person who is asking this question? Who is the person who is ascribing meaning to movement? This is another story, right? Because in fact, we could say that whenever we encounter social interactions, we encounter multiple perspectives, multiple subjects who are building something together in an intersubjective manner. So we could say that it is the I who is interacting, yes, with my own first person perspective, but I also recognize that my partner in an interaction is also someone with their own perspective. So there's the second person perspective. And of course, there might be an external observer for this interaction, also interpreting what's going on, right? So we have this third person perspective. And finally, this is also a kind of assumption or maybe language of a description of what's going on. So if we look at the interaction of two or more people as a coherent whole, as a system which is established through this interaction, and it gains in some sense a level of autonomy because it's self-sustaining, it's regulating itself. This comes from the participatory sense-making theory, which is an active approach to social interactions. So if we allow for this system to be a unit of analysis, then we perhaps also should acknowledge that there is this system-level perspective of what's going on, which is not belonging to any particular participant of the interaction or observer, but it's still there, and it is an epistemic perspective in the sense, not in the sense that the system is building a meaning around itself in a self-reflecting manner, but in a sense that the system, the way the system establishes itself is already a sense-making act. So actually this is all very complex and very difficult, and probably a very interesting case for phenomenology to study. What I'm going to, for today, is to remain at this level of the observer, So I will agree to be the scientist who is outside of the interaction, who is just observing and asking questions, what I can make out of what's going on through observing the interaction dynamics. But at the same time, I recognize that the meaning which I discover may be different from the meaning which is made by the interaction participants. Which, by the way, is very much the same as the situation of neuroscientists who observe the dynamics of the brain, and they can make some sense of what's going in the brain, which is not necessarily the same sense and the same meaning that the person who is participating in the study has. So the next step, which to me is crucial to really decipher the multiple layers of meaning of movement in interpersonal interactions, is the notion of timescales. So I am observing a particular interaction which is taking place in a particular context, most of the time in a real time, because I am interested in this very much ongoing movement interactions. So I would call this here and now time scale. But at the same time, I recognize that whatever is happening is not happening without context. So it's always happening within a certain situation. If it's an experimental situation, then this is a situation which I, as an experimenter, helped to create. I made certain conditions. I defined a task for my participants to perform. And this is all, of course, constraining the interaction that I get. And of course, there are also timescales of even slower time. So there's a timescale of general dispositions of the people which come to my study, their skills, their habits, and so on. And then, of course, there's culture as another layer, which is above the layer of a particular person. It's very much shaping what's going on. It's also evolving, and then there's biology. And I am not really talking about the strict separation of those timescales. It's not the case. They are never strictly separated. But whenever I am looking at a particular interaction which is taking place, and I am trying to derive some categories to describe what's going on, the categories that I derive for description, those labels, they will pertain to different timescales. And then this is a picture I am going to show multiple times during this presentation. This is this picture of the duality which I have in my title. It's a duality between scaffolding and constraining of an interaction. So the story which I tell is like that. This is my interaction which is taking place most of the time here and now on a fast time scale. And here I have some context which lives on the slower time scale. So if this is here and now, this may be the situational context, or this might be skills and habits of my participants, or this might be culture if I am doing intercultural, cross-cultural study, and so on. So I have those two timescales. I will be interested in observing movement as a sort of indicator of what's going on in the interaction dynamics. And more specifically, I will be interested in what's going on between two people. So this will be movement, interpersonal movement coordination, which lives somewhere here, which might be an indicator of what's going here. Now, what are the relations which I will observe? Well, those are the relations between the dynamics of the ongoing interaction and some context which is above it. Context, so those might be experimental conditions, or those might be some individual differences which I am interested in, and so on. So, of course, the context is always constraining the dynamics of the interaction which is taking place. So, if I am having a conversation in a very noisy car, this conversation will have a different dynamics than when I am having a chat in a cafe, right? But then, the ongoing interaction, it's also an opportunity for an organization to emerge and later, through repeated interactions, to scaffold the construction of a context for future interactions. So in a way, this is a way of bottom-up emergence of new structures. And if we will think about it in details, then even very slow changes on a very large time scales, like changes in our genotype on an evolutionary time scale, they all somehow are based on the dynamics which is here and now. So somehow, whatever happens here and now, it has to be transferred through multiple timescales back to the evolutionary timescale and then expressed as some forms of constraints which will later on work top-down to regulate the interaction that we have. And those two influences, those are not, how should I put it? It's not about the naive portrayal of causality as a sort of direct transfer of energy or mass or anything. Those are systemic forms of causation, which here constitute an example of circular causality. So it's not possible to look only in one direction, but we need to acknowledge that this is a full circle going on. So I know this is probably the most abstract slide I am presenting in this presentation, so I thought that it would be good to simpler it a little bit. So here you have a simplified version with an example. So if I am friends with somebody, I am just more likely to spend a fun time with this person. So whenever I'm with this person, I'm more likely to have fun. But through having a fun time with someone, I'm just getting to know this person better, and eventually there's a higher chance we will become friends. So this is the circle. This is the circular process which is going on. And it's hard to say which precedes which, right? It's always, both ways, but on the different time scales. This is what's important for me. So basically, this is what I was going to say today, and there is not much to add. But I will just give you a couple of more examples, okay? And now those examples will be just more complex because those will be examples for the studies that I've done. But it will be all the same story. It will be a story about the circular causality and constraining and scaffolding. So, I will start with the first one. It's one of those studies from the lockdown periods when we were all trying to deal with the lockdown. in our own way. One of the strategies is to make a scientific study out of this situation. So I think you know what I'm talking about. So this is a very simple, small exploratory study, you could say, on the way we interact with people face to face, naturally, versus the way we interact with people remotely on Zoom. And the question is really very simple, whether the patterns of movement coordination which we observe under those two conditions, just in a casual chat, are visibly different from one another. So is this Zoom video call situation with all the glitches, delays, limited field of view, etc., does it influence the way we coordinate with another person, which of course might be important for the experience that we have during this interaction. So we did really a very miniature study with just 3 male and 3 female dyads, which had to just have unstructured small talk about work, studies, holiday plans, etc. And for all of the dyads, they had this conversation in 4 different conditions. So it was either remotely or face to face. And as a additional condition, which we thought it might be influential factor on the interaction dynamics, is whether I see only my interlocutor, right? Or maybe I'm using this split screen setting when I'm seeing both my interlocutor and myself, which is a little bit of unnatural. It's like talking in front of the mirror. So in a face-to-face condition, we try to replicate it by using a mirror. Well, actually it wasn't a mirror, it was a smartphone screen, but with the same, the idea was the same, to just have in my field of vision both my interlocutor and the mirror image of myself. So, we recorded the conversations in those 4 conditions, and then we used open pose system. It's a software for tracking body parts positions based on a simple video recordings without any markers. So this is an example of how the conversation looks like in a face-to-face condition. We have 2 interlocutors, right? And what we were actually interested in was the position of the tip of the nose as a sort of proxy for head movements during the conversation. So, of course, there is a very characteristic nodding pattern of head movement. Nodding is probably the most frequent kind of movement. There's a little bit of swaying from side to side, adjusting position, etc. So the signal that we extracted from this was just a shift in position of the tip of the nose in a horizontal and vertical axis. And it was normalized, so we weren't interested in the size of the movement, but only in the direction of the movement. So in simpler terms, we're interested whether people coordinate their nodding motions in any particular way. So for example, do we have episodes of simultaneous nodding, or maybe somebody is just, I don't know, moving in some other way. So horizontal movement is this, let's say, general level of mobility, like adjusting my position on my chair, while nodding, we are pretty much sure is a particular form of interpersonal synchrony, which might be important for interaction. and then in order to quantify this interpersonal movement coordination, we used a technique called recurrence quantification analysis, actually cross-recurrence quantification analysis. So I won't talk about that in details. The general idea is that it is a way of quantifying different patterns of being coordinated with another person. So not only being synchronized with another, but also moving between different orders of organization. For example, following a person for some time and then reversing the roles, allowing the other person to follow me, keeping in sync, then going out of sync within particular periods of time. So the way this analysis is performed is actually very simple, even though the theoretical background is quite deep. We get a time series which is generated from our data. Let's say this is the blue line here. Then we do something which is called time delay embedding. It's a technique also from dynamical systems, where we expect that whatever we are observing, whatever dynamics we are observing in the system, is not driven by a single factor that we are observing, but rather it's a result of multiple entangled state variables, which are never separated, they are never independent, but they are all influencing each other in a complex nonlinear fashion. So even though we are observing only a single signal out of the many possible state variables which might be important, we can reconstruct the topology of the state space by duplicating the same signal that we have with a certain time delay, and then what we obtain is a multidimensional signal in which different, let's say, recurrent components are decoupled. So sometimes we can see that being in the same point here on the blue line, it has a different meaning if it is here or if it is there, because the time delay embeddings of this signal, they align themselves differently. So this is a little bit makes the interpretation of the results less straightforward, but it makes it possible to really find more subtle interdependencies. So then from this multidimensional time series, we calculate something called recurrence plot. Recurrence plot is basically a plot where we have a time dimension of both x and y axis. And what we are interested in whether the time slice of one time series at a given time point is similar to the time slice of another time series at another time point. And if it is similar, then we put a dot on the plot. Just like that. Yeah. And we have a plot with two-dimensional patterns, which we can then quantify in a very geometric fashion. So we will just count the numbers of dots on this plot, either in columns or in rows or diagonals. And those are the statistics which we will use for characterize the kind of coordination that we observe between our participants. So there is a tradition, of course, of those statistics, and there is some interpretation in terms of dynamical systems. I will just comment that there are some statistics like recurrence rate is just the overall number of black dots that we got. and this is the overall strength of coupling between two people. We can have determinism, so the overall stability of coordination, or entropy of the diagonal line length. So this will correspond to the complexity of coordination structures that we encounter. So sometimes there is only a, let's say, a single mode of coordination for our system, and sometimes the system can be coordinated in multiple different ways, and it can switch between those modes, which will correspond to the higher complexity. And there are also measures which allow us to discuss the individual movement, so the stability and complexity of individual movement in an interaction. And all of those are, of course, they are not fully independent. They are dependent on each other, but they give us different angles to look at the coordination. So, coming back to the remote and face-to-face conversations, here we have different coordination statistics across our 4 conditions, and for most of those, the differences are huge and very unlikely to obtain, like, under null hypothesis. So, for instance, determinism is much larger in live interactions than in remote interactions, which means that the amount of stability that we are able to have when just normally conversing and coordinating in a particular fashion is much larger when we are sitting face to face rather than on Zoom. And it's the same with, mostly the same with laminarity, also the entropy, so the complexity, the overall complexity of coordination is much larger in face-to-face interactions, which is maybe not too surprising.
And this is nose-to-nose coordination, right?
Yes.
Nose tip to nose tip.
Nose tip to nose tip. Mm-hmm. So, this is the story in terms of constraining and scaffolding. We are changing the interaction context because we are changing the interaction medium, right? And what we see how the medium constrains the interaction. So this is why we observe different movement coordination. And we don't know, because we didn't check it in this study, how it actually influences the way the people feel in this interaction. So we don't know whether they feel better when they have a higher stability of coordination or not. Although we can assume that part of the problems that we have with online meetings, Zoom fatigue, and so on, they might stem for the altered coordination patterns. Okay, so that was a simple example of a top-down constraining. Now I will move to another example, which is an example of more complex constraining and scaffolding. And now it's within the context of a nice joint action study where we have pairs of participants performing complex sensory recognition tasks. So those are the stimuli for our task. They were doing wine tasting, and we were interested in how introducing some external language scaffolding now in terms of a Sommelier card, so a card with different sensory dimensions for wine recognition, how it may influence the practice of wine tasting, whether they will, let's say, coordinate around this task in the same fashion or differently. So there were some details in the experimental procedure. Basically, it was a task when they were presented 3 different red wines. They had to sample them and either just discuss their properties or fill in sommelier cards for each of those wines, so doing it in a more structured, principled way. And then in the second phase, the task was to taste 6 new samples of red wine and identify the original 3 among those 6. So here we used a much simpler way of quantifying motion. We used so-called frame difference method. It's a very simplistic measure where you could define regions of interest on your video recording, and then if you just subtract video frames one by one, what you get for each time step a difference of how many pixels changed in a video frame from frame to frame. And if it's a static frame with only people moving inside, this is a way to quantify the overall amount of movement without knowing anything about the movement direction, etc., etc. So it's a very rough measure, and we extracted those for 2 regions of interest corresponding to 2 interaction participants, and also performed RQA analysis on that data. So this is a very unstructured interaction. The goal is to sample red wines. They are sitting together as you see, and what can we expect in terms of movement coordination? Would it be altered when we introduce a sommelier card? Well, not at all. So it's a very unstructured interaction. We didn't find any sort of differences across conditions, between conditions, whether they used a card or not. Then within each condition, we're interested in, okay, so, but does this movement coordination, is it predictive for task performance in some way, right? So maybe if they coordinate better on the movement level, it means that they also are able to recognize the wines better, make better decisions. So when in no card condition there was no relation at all, and then finally in the card condition, out of the sudden movement became meaningful, and particular statistics of movement coordination were predictive for task performance. By the way, the overall strength of coupling is not necessarily the measure which is positively related to task performance, to joint action task performance. Here, the relation is negative. So too much coordination, too much coupling is not necessarily a good thing. So the interpretation of this in terms of the constraining and scaffolding story is that we have movement coordination as something which is indicating the interaction dynamics, and then we have, this is a condition, right, which we control, experimental condition, so this is part of the context, and the performance is also something which is on the slower time scale, which is, in a way, it's a result of this interaction, but not a straightforward result, but something which, so whatever happens here is a part of a long decision-making process which eventually leads to a particular performance. So we interpret this as an introduction of a change in context which doesn't reflect directly in movement coordination, but the change in context, it makes the way movement coordination scaffolds performance, it alters it. So it's a transformation, you could say that this is a transformation of the meaning of movement coordination. Outside of this context of card, it's not meaningful for performance at all. When you introduce the card, then it becomes meaningful. So, so in a way, we need both of those relations here. So we need the card as something which constrains the interaction, and then it transforms the scaffolding. Okay, so I will quickly go through the last study, which I believe demonstrates the circular causality all the way through. It's this is a study which concerned social development of young children. We're interested in whether the movement coordination in parent-child interaction relates in any way to what we know from batteries of standard theory of mind tests, which were run at different developmental moments on the children. So basically, we use data from a longer developmental study. We used quite standard scores in theory of mind tasks, plus some controls, and we try to correlate those with the movement coordination in so-called labyrinth task. So as you see, this is just a simple toy which you can buy in a toy store, and the task is to lead a small ball here through the wooden labyrinth from one side to another, which you do by pulling on the strings in a coordinated fashion. And we can again record this on the video and quantify movement coordination. We can also have some measure of performance, but by the number of successful trials per minute. Again, we use the same very simplistic frame difference method for quantifying coordination. We used recurrence quantification analysis. We just throw in all the variables that we had in a single big structural equation model, which is maybe not that important. The important part is that we are interested in what are the predictors of this and this. So we are interested in what kind of movement coordination is associated with good performance, and what kind of movement coordination is associated with high scores in theory of mind tasks. Okay, so first of all, yes, 5 minutes or 3. Yeah. So first of all, this is about performance, and even though we might expect that good theory of mind is helpful for coordinating with other people and it's helpful for achieving success in coordinated tasks, it is not what is visible here. However, there are certain patterns of movement coordination. For instance, here, having a large overall strength of coupling, which is beneficial for achieving success. Which here is maybe natural, because this task is explicitly about coordination, right? So it is to be expected that the high amount of coupling is beneficial. But then, if we look at what is predictive for the high level of theory of mind, it turns out that we see a little bit different pattern. Here the overall strength of coupling is negatively associated with theory of mind. So the story has to be more complex. In a way, we see that this is what is visibly associated with the greater success in task. And this, what is associated with theory of mind, where there are certain patterns, for example, low complexity of parents movement and high stability of parents movement. And simultaneously, this is reversed, high complexity of child's movement and low stability of child's movement, which suggests that there's certain role division here, and maybe there is a particular notion of a parent-child relation where the parent is more stable, providing scaffolding, and the child is just free to explore and try different things, which might provide a good opportunity for social development.
But not for task performance.
But not necessarily for task performance, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's different. It's something which in the long run might be good for developing social cognition, but this is not necessarily linked to achieving success in this coordinative game. So this is why I am saying this is the whole story about the circular causality, because what we observed here is both constraining. By constraining, I mean that there are certain resources, like parent-child abilities, which are here pulled in order to achieve the success in the coordinative task. At the same time, we expect that what we are seeing are also patterns of movement coordination which are indicating a particular relation over the years, maybe particular, it's a glimpse into a dynamics of a longer process going on the developmental scale, which might be this interaction experience necessary to scaffold the development of social cognition skills. Yeah. So I am amazed actually that using very simple methods and very rough measurement of movement coordination, it is possible to find relations to very, let's say, multi-scale phenomena portraying social interactions. And I believe that there's a lot of meaning to unpack from movement. At the same time, it's never, it's always multi-scale. It always happens within this circular causality process, which makes the interpretation perhaps more straightforward, less straightforward, but more satisfying in a way. Who knows? Either way, if we really want to take the movement seriously, I believe that we need to embrace that there will be always multiple scales of description, that there will be some emergent properties, and that it will be the case of circular causality. So, thank you very much, you the audience. I also am very grateful for all my collaborators across the different institutions, the funding agencies, and the Faculty of Psychology, University of Warsaw, that was also funding part of this research.